the rise of the United States of America as a world power. It found its essence in a group of determined, resourceful, hardworking, and often unscrupulous men who pushed that nation to a growth that even surpassed its former British metropolis. One of the greatest embodiments of these men was John Pierpont Morgan, who rose as the most powerful banker in his country's history, achieving an unprecedented level of influence over the finances, industry, wallets, and even the culture of an entire nation and later the world. His skill as a businessman and his immense influence as a pioneer of the business world that would dominate the 20th century consolidated the United States as the powerhouse we know today and paved the way for the era of great global magnates and colossal private capitalist monopolies, capable of bending not only the American state but the state of any part of the world. His figure and his legacy are crucial to understanding the American ideal of development and infinite material progress, which would pave the way for the United States to become the world's hegemon. Join us to hear this amazing story. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches. Welcome to the New Encyclopedia, and I invite you to give us great support by liking this video and leaving your comments, which we always read, by turning on notifications with the bell, subscribing to the channel, of course, and sharing this material with all your contacts on WhatsApp, on social media, and anywhere else. So, without anything else to add, let's start with today's story. John Pierpont Morgan was born on April 17, 1837 in the city of Hartford, which was the capital of the state of Connecticut, in the region known as New England, in the northeast of the United States of America. This was a young nation that dazzled the world with the success of its Republican and liberal system, in a world that until then had been mostly dominated by the ancient European monarchies. On his father's side, Morgan was descended from an old farming family from the Kingdom of Wales, which had settled in the North American country since the mid-17th century. However, his grandfather, Joseph Morgan, was the first in the family to leave farming to pursue other occupations, mainly trade, thus beginning a long and powerful dynasty of businessmen whose activity was lending. Also, the father of our protagonist, Junius Morgan, who entered the world of finance as a merchant banker in New York City, gradually managing to increase his family's wealth. On his mother's side, Morgan's mother, Juliet Pierpont. She also comes from an important family of prominent scholars and famous politicians who played a significant role in the American independence process. American literature. So Morgan grows up in an affluent family environment where the needs of the time were not a problem during his childhood, although he would have some recurring health problems, such as skin diseases, which would prevent him from functioning normally in some aspects. Now then, before moving forward, it's important to talk about that vigorous nation, so revolutionary and rapidly changing, in which Morgan was born. The American nation has its distant origins in the first English settlements on the northeast coast of the American continent at the beginning of the 17th century. The English, who in Europe were in the midst of a race to expand their limited domains, would transplant themselves to these regions. Their Protestant faith and their mercantile and seafaring spirit, at the same time, they would almost completely exterminate the native population, and they began establishing the famous 13 colonies that stretched from north to south along the east coast of that region. Each of these colonies with a type of government that, although similar, was different and independent from the others. In this way, almost entirely, an environment of customs, traditions, and political principles was created, made in the image and likeness of Old England from the Elizabethan era, a system, moreover, made in the image and likeness of what has been called the Anglo-Saxon Protestant white man, or better known as White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, by its initials in English. Nevertheless, little by little, these colonies, which are developing in the north, an economy based on trade and industry, and in the south, an economy mostly based on agriculture and slave labor brought from Africa, are growing rapidly, both in population and in autonomy, until finally, after several political and economic disagreements with the British Crown, the so-called Founding Fathers, influenced by the spirit of liberalism, the Enlightenment, and classical republicanism. Most of them also gathered in secret societies such as Freemasonry. They are going to declare the independence of those 13 colonies and unite them into a new country called the United States of America on July 4th, 1776, adopting a republican, federal, constitutional, and representative form of government. This quest for autonomy will lead to the so-called American War of Independence, which will pit the supporters of independence against each other, against the supporters of the British Crown, which will last until 1783, ending with the British Crown's recognition of the new nation across the ocean. In this way, as the 18th century ended and the 19th century began, they were now citizens of an independent nation that had inherited the best of commerce, the technique and enlightenment of the English metropolis. The leaders of the American nation, with an eye on expanding their territory, formulated the so-called Manifest Destiny, a political religious doctrine that claimed the United States was a sort of nation, chosen and predestined to expand from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast, bringing its values and culture to the rest of the region. And besides this, they managed to annex the territory of Mississippi and negotiated with France the purchase of the vast territory of Louisiana. In 1803, and with Spain, they also managed to have Florida ceded to them in 1819. However, as we said, the expansion promoted by the ideologues of Manifest Destiny was not just a mere territorial expansion, but a true process of cultural, political, and economic consolidation of poverty, the population of the United States of America over its new territories. Therefore, over time, Americans began to populate the annexed territories, and they started establishing new settlements, some of which eventually became cities. Eventually, they created new states that joined the federal government. This was the historical context in which our protagonist, John Pierpont Morgan, was born, a time marked by the emergence of the Great Imperial Nation Project, in which Morgan would play no small part. During his youth, Morgan would have a rebellious and undisciplined character. In fact, when it came to studying, he attended 9 schools in Hartford, where he had the habit of climbing trees to court young ladies from their windows. In the spring of 1850, Morgan's father decided to move the family to the city of Boston to start a new import business there in Boston. Morgan, at 13 years old, now dedicated himself seriously to his studies, enrolling in the Episcopal Academy and eventually in Boston High School. There, he learned languages such as Latin and Greek and developed himself in different areas of knowledge. At that time, Morgan developed an interest in finance as well as in arithmetic. He kept track of his income and expenses in a notebook and took charge of managing the accounts of his father's business. However, Morgan suffered from a painful joint disease that left him with a severe limp. On medical advice, he had to look for new places and a change of environment to improve his condition. Towards the end of 1852, at the age of 15, Morgan embarked on his first ocean voyage to the island of Faial in the Azores archipelago in Portugal. There, he was captivated by the port activity of the island, carefully observing and asking the sailors about the commercial dynamism of the ships that docked there. In April 1853, Morgan went to England to join part of his family and accompanied his father to important meetings with bankers in London. Then he began a tour of the rest of Europe, where he managed to see from a distance at various events the main monarchs of the old continent. Back in Boston, Morgan wrapped up his trip, finished high school, and at the same time his father made a key move for both of their lives. When he partnered with the London firm of the powerful American banker George Peabody, forming the Peabody Morgan Company, this meant a huge leap for the Morgan family, who were now beginning to build a powerful banking empire. As a result of this new major venture, the family moved to the city of London, and Junius Morgan, the father of our protagonist, would be in charge of managing the business of his partner, George Peabody, who was in the process of retiring. At the same time, Morgan was sent by his father to Switzerland to study, so that eventually at the age of 18 or 19, he could enter the German University of Göttingen. With the goal of becoming fluent in German and other foreign languages necessary for international business in Germany, Morgan would have an exceptional academic performance, excelling in languages, algebra, and trigonometry. Young Morgan didn't know that all his various academic preparations would come together to bring him great rewards in his future professional life. After finishing his time at university, Morgan meets his father in London, where he formally enters the family business. Thus, he officially began to work in the powerful world of finance, that is, in the money industry, in the industry of creating and managing capital. So in August of 1857, he traveled to New York and established his residence there, working as a representative of his father's firm, the energetic and vigorous one, United States, specifically in the area of short-term commercial financing. When Morgan returned to the United States, the country was facing a major economic crisis as a result of the global downturn known as the Panic of 1857. This crisis marked the end of the economic expansion that had characterized the United States following the gold rush, which began in 1848. However, Morgan, now 20 years old, would not be intimidated by this situation. And in a curious episode, he decided to risk his father's firm's money to buy a shipment of coffee at the port of New Orleans. His prediction was that there would be an abrupt change in the market and in prices that would allow him to resell it quickly at a markup, which in fact he manages to do and earns a profitable gain. But despite this success, the deal earns him the disapproval of his father's firm, which denies him the chance to become a partner. In rejection of these highly speculative practices, the decision also has the support of his father, Junius, who condemns the maneuver for considering it a usurious behavior. This episode, however, reveals the ambitious and cunning character of the young Morgan. By 1861, Morgan witnesses the presidential victory of the renowned Abraham Lincoln, a victory that, as we mentioned earlier, comes with an intensification of political and social conflicts in the North American nation. Conflicts that are the result of different visions on how to lead the country in economic, political, and social matters, as well as issues like slavery. This conflict eventually leads to the secession of the southern states from the American state and the union of these states as a new independent nation under the name Confederate States of America. This directly leads to a huge internal conflict without precedent in the history of the United States, known as the American Civil War, which will pit the Unionists against the Confederates. Morgan, for his part, had no desire to go fight in that war, and he managed to avoid being drafted by paying for a substitute to take his place in the army, a practice that became common among the wealthy classes of American society at that time of war. As hostilities continued to develop, Morgan changed his approach to doing business after the collapse of cotton exports and the decline in railroad construction. Faced with this, he decides to devote himself fully to the stock market business, that is, the financial business. At the same time, Morgan takes advantage of the war situation by lending money to people who bought old government rifles and resold them to the Union Army with a huge profit. A purely speculative operation that added no value to the economy, and even less so in a wartime situation, for which the young Morgan was accused. However, he wouldn't give it much importance, even though it ended up being one of the most reported cases of speculation in that war. At that time, Morgan also married his fiancée, Amelia Sturgis, on October 7, 1861, who also came from a family of important merchants from Connecticut. However, Amelia had contracted tuberculosis some time before the marriage and would pass away just 4 months later. This devastated J.P. Morgan's spirits as he became a widower at just 25 years old. By September 1862, still stunned by the loss of his wife and also angry because his bosses refused to make him a partner, Morgan decided to found his own firm where he focused on trading government bonds and currencies, financing commodity operations, and informing London about prices and United States politics. By October 1864, the firm Peabody Morgan Company was dissolved after the partnership term expired. Even so, Morgan's father decided to continue his business with his new commercial firm called J.S. Morgan Company, which eventually became an important international banking house. Thus, in this way, Junius, J.P. Morgan's father, sought to strengthen his son's firm by including a new and respected business partner known as Charles Dabney. He would play the role of mentor to J.P. Morgan to help him perfect his business skills. And after this, Morgan eventually decides to dissolve his firm to fully join his father's company. The economic contraction caused by the Civil War made the Morgan firm lose money due to capital flight. However, after the victory of the Unionists in 1865, a new era of economic expansion began in the North. An era in which, as we will see later, the Morgans will manage to establish themselves as great international bankers. But going back to the young life of our protagonist, Morgan interrupts his work to marry again the beautiful Françoise Louisa Tracy, daughter of a prominent Wall Street lawyer and 6 years younger than him, a marriage that will eventually have 5 children. The couple goes on their honeymoon to Europe, where Morgan takes the opportunity to meet with his father and make new plans for a future that looked very promising for the Morgan dynasty. As we mentioned, after the Civil War, the United States will emerge as a world power over the next few decades through a rapid economic, industrial, and cultural expansion, an era of unprecedented progress, known as the Gilded Age, where the companies and businesses of the nation's leading tycoons will also play a fundamental role in the country's destiny. This is also the peak of capitalism as a mode of production on a global scale. In this sense, by 1869, Morgan would be a direct witness to this national development, venturing for the first time to the west of the country on the newly inaugurated Transcontinental Railroad. A feat of engineering and human labor, it would stretch for more than 10,000 kilometers and would revolutionize the economy and human relations of that country. This experience would renew Morgan's interest in investing in the railroad sector, which was booming at the time. So Morgan returns New York, and he faces a legal dispute in order to gain control of a railroad that had just been completed in upstate New York. There, Morgan, at 32 years old, surprises many with his legal maneuvers, using a partner's company to acquire the majority of the railroad's shares. And then he calls a shareholders' meeting to decide through a vote the control of the company. The result will be a victory for Morgan, which will later be ratified by a higher state court. Morgan, in this way, he satisfies most of the parties involved in the conflict and raises his reputation among the business community as one of the strong men of American banking. As Morgan develops in the railroad sector, He also diversifies his investments into all kinds of lucrative businesses. From that time, ranging from cotton and grains to heavy machinery, factories, refineries, and mills. It's worth noting that at that time the United States operated without a central bank, without a centralized bank. That would be the sole authority to issue currency and regulate credit. So private banks and private bankers, especially those in the investment sector, had an almost official capacity to issue currency. That is, to be a monetary issuing entity, which began to spark an important debate in American civil society about the power these big capitalists were accumulating and the level of influence they had over people's wallets. As Morgan's career grew, he took his first steps in what would later be called philanthropy, the practice in which great magnates and capitalists invest money, not only in their companies but also in the world of education, medicine, food, culture, and science. In the case of Morgan, he started by funding the founding of the Museum of Natural History and later the Museum of Art in New York, together with Theodore Roosevelt Sr., who was the father of the future American president. This was an early example of the future fusion between big capital and culture and academia, embodied in figures such as the Rockefeller Foundation and later various billionaires, up to the present day. In the midst of all this, in 1871, his partner and mentor, Charles Dabney, suddenly left the commercial company. This leads Morgan to consider leaving the financial business. However, with his father's intervention, Morgan decides instead to create a new firm, this time in partnership with a man named Anthony Joseph Drexel, who was a prominent international banker from Philadelphia, whose operational base was in Paris. Amid this major debate on banking and monetary issues in the United States, in 1873, the Treasury Department of that country asked Morgan to create a syndicate of investors to help the federal government replace $300 million in high-interest Civil War bonds, bonds that had been given by the federal government during the war to citizen investors in order to finance itself, and to substitute them with newly issued bonds that would pay a lower interest rate. This would be the first test of the power and influence that Morgan had been amassing over the United States government. What was said at that time was that there was a shortage of capital and monetary liquidity during that era. In the face of the debts that existed, they threatened to trigger a weak domino effect of debts that could lead to a serious economic depression. The fear among the population of losing their savings in the event of a bank collapse was something palpable and discussed daily, which led, in that year, 1873, to a massive withdrawal of funds from the banks, further worsening the crisis. Faced with the federal government's inability to deal with this financial situation, it found itself needing to turn to prominent bankers like Morgan to address the issue. During this crisis, Morgan's intelligence and cunning would stand out above the other bankers, managing to maneuver and establish himself in a role similar to that of a central bank during that time, organizing loans and importing money from England to inject capital in the face of the recession. Eventually, in this scenario of economic decline, the so-called Panic of 1873 occurred, the much-feared collapse, in which, faced with a massive withdrawal of capital by the savers from those banks, they became insolvent and unable to meet their commitments, causing not only the collapse of banks, but also the collapse of companies and massive layoffs, and exposing what some have called and considered the first systemic crisis of global capitalism. Beyond the economic crisis, the truth is that we mention Morgan. Rather, he knew how to take advantage of it to increase his wealth and further consolidate his position in global banking. And not only that, but in the United States, he was finally consolidating himself as one of the most important figures in the financial world. In the following years, Morgan moved his investments very cautiously because of the era's volatility. He also became stubborn and methodical in his work. He used to avoid interviews and hated having his picture taken. because of his particular skin condition from acne, which in the past had even deformed his nose. Morgan, who was modest by nature, was not like the vast majority of tycoons of the time, who used to build mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York and throw big parties. However, Morgan did easily associate with powerful businessmen in the most prestigious clubs in the country. At 40 years old, Morgan was a fierce and burly-looking man with gray hair and a handlebar mustache. He was a man who had suffered and would continue to suffer several depressive episodes due to the loss of his first wife and overwork. In fact, his second marriage would not be very fruitful emotionally, as the couple would remain distant for the rest of their lives, keeping up appearances. Indeed, since a divorce would be very counterproductive for his social status in the business world of that time. A time that will also continue to bring surprises for the now established banker John Pierpont Morgan. Well, in the near future, John Pierpont Morgan will not only rise within American history, but he will become the embodiment of a new economic and social system in the world, a new way of life and a new way of doing things within power and the business world. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, the railroad industry became the essential pillar of the economy and of corporate finance. In the United States, the expansion of the railroads had grown rapidly, tripling in capacity and improving in every aspect. This significantly reduced transportation costs and therefore greatly lowered the costs of agriculture, industry, and commerce. Now, this railroad development also facilitates and goes hand in hand with the creation of monopolies. In the context of the rise of capitalism, many large companies, instead of competing with each other, begin to group together into large trusts or cartels to control entire markets. With great insight and vision, Morgan understands this trend and the strategic importance of the railroad, and thus seeks to maximize its efficiency by unifying multiple railroad networks under a single organization with the purpose of forming his own railroad trust. In an era when government intervention in business was rare and very uncommon, Morgan manages to mobilize large sums of money from his European partners, with these connections to old world bankers being a key element of his career. And he uses these resources to gain influence on boards of directors and among majority shareholders in several of the major railroad companies. At the same time, he was responsible for financially rescuing other companies that were bankrupt, gradually putting together what he envisioned as a future monopoly in an essential and vital sector of the economy, such as the railroad industry. Morgan reaches his financial peak when he helps the railroad tycoon William Vanderbilt sell most of his holdings, thus avoiding further losses. Due to regulation by the New York State Legislature, Morgan manages to sell 250,000 shares without causing the price to drop, which was common when a large block of shares hit the market. Additionally, with this operation, he receives a commission of $3 million. As we can see, Morgan was establishing himself as a master, almost always unmatched in financial negotiations, and Morgan also demands a seat on the railroad's board of directors to represent his investors in Vanderbilt's company, which was notoriously mismanaged. In this way, the firm Morgan and Drexel, which was his former partner from Philadelphia, gained great prestige by rescuing railroad companies that were bankrupt, to reorganize their management and introduce innovative methods in capital investment and business management. These actions thus establish Morgan as one of the most powerful men in the country and one of the most influential in the world. Morgan, for his part, would continue to diversify his investments in revolutionary projects for the time, such as his partnership with Thomas Edison in 1880. This emerging electrical industry also marked a major milestone in human history, and it was something that fascinated Morgan, who was aware of its importance in the summer of 1882. Morgan believed that Edison's light was developed enough to install a first test system in his house on Madison Avenue. The work on the project was completed in early fall of that year, making it the first private house in New York City to be fully lit with Edison's new incandescent bulbs. Although the system had flaws, it was enough to convince Morgan to invest heavily in Edison's company. That year, Morgan also acquired his iconic steam yacht, the Corsair Fur, the largest and most advanced of its kind in the country, a unique vessel that began to serve as a meeting place to resolve legal, business, political, or any kind of disputes. With his unique charisma, Morgan acted as a mediator between the leading magnates of the American railroad industry aboard the Corsair. For example, the conflict generated by the giants of the steel and oil industries, Andrew Carnegie and John Rockefeller. In 1885 to 1890, the father of our protagonist, Junius Morgan, passed away at the age of 76 after a carriage accident. Morgan will mourn his father for months and will build monuments and buildings in his name. At the same time, Morgan will inherit a sum of $15 million from his father, doubling his personal fortune overnight. At that time, there was a great national controversy regarding this new phenomenon of big capitalists and bankers who were coming together and gaining more and more power within society, even above the state and politicians. In the face of this formation of large oligopolies and monopolies, which according to some threatened free competition and a fair economy, a clash arose between different sectors of the country who proposed that these monopolies should be dissolved or regulated so they wouldn't become absolute owners of the markets. The greatest example of this was the Rockefeller oil monopoly, which crushed all competition. A monopoly that would perfectly complement the industrial monopoly of John Pierpont Morgan, with both rising as the masters and lords of the American economy. It is from this phenomenon of increasing accumulation of power by capitalist sectors that it is promoted. And in 1890, a famous antitrust law was passed in the United States, which sought to impose a series of limitations and conditions on these business cartels. However, these trusts and economic groups will find different maneuvers that allow them to largely maintain their same monopolies and businesses. So, is John Pierpont Morgan not going to be affected by all these laws? In early 1893, the United States experienced a new and catastrophic stock market panic, triggering one of the worst financial and economic depressions seen in that nation up to that point. John Pierpont Morgan takes advantage of this situation to take control of the railroad companies that were going bankrupt because of the Depression, subjecting them to a process popularly known as Morganization. By the middle of the same year, Morgan's main partner, Anthony Drexel, suddenly dies of a stroke. So in this way, Morgan takes over the firm, which now becomes known as John Pierpont Morgan Company, carrying out a tough restructuring that includes a complete replacement of the managers. Was the news that Morgan was running the firm by himself enough to attract the interest of new investors? The economic crisis had caused the National Treasury's gold reserves to drop to critical levels, undermining the gold standard system of that time, and deepening the debate that had already lasted for decades in the United States about which was the best banking system for the country. Morgan, who was already the most powerful banker and acted as the de facto central banker of the United States, proposed in a meeting at the White House that his bank create a sort of syndicate or loose organization. Bankers to sell European and American gold to the federal government in exchange for bonds to be paid in the long term. So, relying on an emergency law that had been passed during the Civil War, Morgan was given permission to buy gold and lend it to the national government, making sure that once it was purchased, it would not leave the country. managing to increase the coffers of the same treasury. In other words, the United States government took on a large debt with John Pierpont Morgan and the world's leading bankers to inject money into its economy and stabilize the financial crisis. All of this would be carried out exactly in the coming months, also backed by leading politicians who collaborated closely with these bankers. In this way, John Pierpont Morgan and a small group of bankers became the main creditors of the government and the American people. For the 1896 elections, President Cleveland would be removed from the Democratic Party for being the face of the economic crisis, and he would be replaced by the new candidate, William Jennings, who, in the midst of this economic crisis, would have a hostile speech against bankers like Morgan, against monopolies, and against the gold standard as a monetary and banking system. Morgan, for his part, would support the Republican candidate William McKinley, donating large sums of money to the campaign, as well as other bankers who sought the institutionalization of the gold standard. At the end of the presidential race, McKinley emerged victorious with 52% of the votes. And eventually, he institutionalized the so-called gold standard with the Gold Standard Act of 1900, which marked the beginning of a new era for the economy and money in the world, as well as a new era for the already consolidated empire. Morgan. At the beginning of the new century, Morgan meets with Andrew Carnegie, a steel industry magnate. In the midst of fierce competition between the two, Carnegie proposes to him that they should merge both companies and create a gigantic trust that would control more than half of the steel business worldwide. So taking the proposal, Morgan agrees to unify the companies and establish what would be called United States Steel, the largest company in the world at that time, and the first one valued at $1 billion, whose magnitude even surpassed the budget of the United States federal government, thus consolidating Morgan at the peak of his power. By that time, there was no doubt in public opinion that Morgan had become the most important and prestigious banker in the United States. He was considered among the world's most powerful men. Although some of his actions were publicly criticized, the perception of most of the public about Morgan was that of a benevolent capitalist who had enough power to stop major stock market crises in the vigorous American economy, an economy that had already far surpassed that of the old European empires. This public perception was reaffirmed when John Pierpont Morgan entered a business battle against the railroad tycoon Henry Harriman in 1901, who was trying to take control of the railroads in the northeastern United States by purchasing $78 million in shares, an unprecedented operation at the time. But this move once again triggered a severe stock market and financial crisis that drove dozens of investors into bankruptcy. In response, Morgan intervened, as was already customary, and managed to convince Harriman to refrain from taking possession of the shares he had acquired. With those $78 million, Morgan, for his part, and also in the midst of public scrutiny, decided to take the same measure, and both of them chose to sell their shares at a lower price, thus managing to contain the financial panic at that moment and winning another crucial battle in the stock market world. However, the situation of the Morgan Empire takes an unexpected turn when the assassination of the President of the United States, McKinley, occurs in September 1901. This leads to the rise to power and the presidency of the Republic of Theodore Roosevelt, who had demonstrated during his term as governor of New York his toughness in demanding that big business fulfill its obligations and his refusal to submit or easily give in to the conditions and demands of big business. In the midst of this great national debate about the growing power being accumulated by this small group of businessmen, Roosevelt began to advocate in his speeches for the control of the so-called trusts, for the regulation of these unions or cartels of big businessmen who not only controlled large sectors of the markets, but were also gaining increasing influence in politics and the press. So Roosevelt set in motion a series of policies with the argument of promoting free and fair competition. These would be based on the enforcement of the 1890 Antitrust Act, which we mentioned earlier. At first, Roosevelt's government seeks to dismantle the trust of Morgan's Northern Pacific Railway Company. And in fact, the operation leaves John Pierpont Morgan stunned by the fact that Roosevelt did not agree to a deal or negotiation. Generally generous to him, he avoided federal government intervention in the tycoon's business, something he had achieved with previous administrations. But Roosevelt, without hesitation, manages to get the government to intervene in that sector of John Pierpont Morgan's railroad monopoly. Roosevelt aimed to strengthen the central government to control the abuses of large corporations against vulnerable people. This position contrasted with that of John Pierpont Morgan, who argued that giant corporations were necessary to compete in world markets. And although the relationship between them was tense at first, Roosevelt did not hesitate to turn to Morgan shortly afterward to establish an international trust dedicated to the transatlantic shipping market, receiving financing from Morgan to acquire several British shipping lines in order to strengthen the maritime power of the American nation. At 70 years old, with his health already weakened, Morgan was on the verge of retirement. However, in 1907, a new financial panic shook Wall Street after the sudden collapse of the stock market, threatening to unleash a systemic crisis of global proportions that seriously threatened to cause a great economic depression. For better or for worse, John Pierpont Morgan was the master of finance, not only in America, but worldwide, and he knew that world like no one else. So, after the failure of other lesser figures to stabilize the situation that year, Morgan was practically acclaimed to take the lead in handling it. So Morgan devoted himself tirelessly for months, working shifts of up to 15 hours, abruptly summoning the presidents of the trust companies, stockbrokers, and members of the clearinghouse bank in long days of negotiations and conversations, reaching new agreements and distributing punishments and rewards. In the midst of this financial crisis, in order to normalize the economic situation as smoothly as possible and in the most beneficial way for its stakeholders in this drama, the Secretary of the Treasury of the federal government plays a secondary role next to the de facto plenipotentiary minister, who was John Pierpont Morgan. While the Bank of England and the Bank of France barely intervened, Morgan's calls were unavoidable and his leadership unquestionable. Even the president readily approved that United States Steel, the great monopoly in Morgan's hands, should make acquisitions in that financial crisis situation. An iron and steel company belonging to a brokerage that was bankrupt, something that under normal circumstances would have triggered an antitrust investigation, but in this case was completely accepted. So John Pierpont Morgan benefited once again from an economic crisis. And when the financial crisis finally passed and the news of what Morgan had accomplished had sunk in, there were many suggestions, debates, and controversies that the bankers, including Morgan, had engineered this crisis to enrich themselves, or at the very least that they had done nothing but take advantage of it. The truth is that despite the good press he gets, in some ways the public perception of Morgan is also being seriously damaged. For the same reason, the newly elected president in 1909, Howard Taft, decided to avoid meeting with John Pierpont Morgan due to the political cost it would entail. After his reputation suffered, people no longer saw him as the economy's savior, but as someone who exploited it. In this way, Morgan began to spend the last years of his life withdrawn from public life in the United States. The taciturn Morgan spent his last years sailing through Europe, feeling misunderstood and enraged by the criticism of his business and himself. On some occasions, he even raised his cane against reporters who approached him and questioned him about the various legal disputes, convictions, and accusations against his businesses. Morgan would face the tough competition of the industry, shipping, being part of the story of the iconic Royal Mail ship Titanic, financing its construction in 1909, and attending its christening. However, in 1912, while he was on vacation in Europe, he learned about the sinking of the ocean liner on its maiden voyage, putting Morgan in the eye of the storm. Faced with such a tragedy, it brought him enormous financial losses and all kinds of theories, conjectures, and speculations behind the sinking. All this was happening at the same time, while he was sailing on a yacht with the Kaiser of Germany and the cousin of the King of England in 1912. In the United States, the mood and the atmosphere were heating up against the trusts and Morgan's corporations. The arrival of the Democratic President Woodrow Wilson at the White House brought, at least in appearance and in public discourse, a war against monopolies. This way, Morgan would face public ridicule. Summoned to a hearing at the request of the House of Representatives, he was obliged to testify about his financial activities throughout his life, at a time when he was already largely retired. As a result of the hearings and with the argument, among others, of supposedly limiting the power of these great bankers, that year, the law establishing the Federal Reserve of the United States was approved. The creation of the Federal Reserve, a sort of central bank, but under the ownership of private bankers. It's one of the 20th century's most controversial and significant events, deserving attention. A video to unravel the reality and nature of this institution. But going back to Morgan's life in the midst of these historical events, what about the smear campaign that was launched against him? It was too much for an aging Morgan, who would suffer constant nervous breakdowns as a result of these events. Delegating his authority to his eldest son, Jack Morgan, the old Morgan leaves New Europe seeking peace, not knowing it would be his last journey. In March, a dying Morgan will be transferred to Rome, where he is received by a group of doctors from New York who take care of him. However, at noon on March 31, 1912, Morgan passes away in the company of his daughter Louisa, at the age of 75, causing shock around the world. He receives condolences from Pope Pius X. His coffin is escorted by the Italian army, and he leaves behind an estimated fortune of more than $68 million. Morgan's body would be repatriated to the United States and received in New York City with the flag at half-mast, and the stock exchange is closed for 2 hours. He is buried beside his father, Junius, in the Morgan Mausoleum in his honor. The newspapers refer to him as the Napoleon of Wall Street. It is suggested that the last great economic titan had died, and that the world of banking would never again see a figure of such stature. Receiving praise from the country's leading figures such as Theodore Roosevelt, the work of J.P. Morgan has remained and is still visible to this day, not only in a new world where men of wealth became the great men of power, but even in concrete financial entities, such as the largest bank in the world that bears his name, that is J.P. Morgan Chase Bank, with a presence in more than 100 countries and whose listing on the United States stock market exceeds $841 billion. John Pierpont Morgan, not only a skilled master of banking and finance, but also of human relations in the world of politics. He leaves an indelible mark on the American collective imagination as the man who not only built the largest monopoly of his time, but also as the one who helped build the United States into the richest and most powerful capitalist power in the world. Thank you all so much from the bottom of my heart for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I want to remind you that your support really gives us a big boost and is a great help. By interacting with the channel, leaving your comments, liking the videos, sharing the content on social media, on WhatsApp, and in any other space, and by turning on the notification bell so you get notified every time we publish new content. So thank you all again, and may God bless you.